My father said girls don't need degrees, so I graduated without his help. There's a sentence I have heard so many times in my life that I could probably recite it in my sleep, in my father's exact tone of voice, down to the pause right before the last word. Girls don't need degrees. I heard it the first time when I was 12 years old, sitting at the dinner table, asking why my older brother was getting a tutor for his college entrance exams and I wasn't, even though my grades were better than his. I heard it again at 16, when I asked if I could apply to a summer program for high-achieving students. And I heard it one final time, the last time it would ever matter, the day I told my father I'd been accepted into university, and he looked at me across the kitchen table and said, calmly, like he was stating a fact as obvious as the weather, "You won't be needing that. Girls don't need degrees. You need a husband." What he didn't know that day, what none of them knew, was that I had already made a decision. I was going to that university, with or without his blessing, with or without his money, with or without a single person in that house believing I could do it. This is the story of how I graduated completely on my own, of what it cost me to do it, and of the truth that came out years later that made my father's own words come back to haunt him in a way none of us saw coming. Stay until the end, because this story does not end the way you think it will. For this video, let's call me Layla. I'm 28 years old now, and I want to tell you a little about who I was before any of this happened, because I think it matters for understanding just how deep this went. I was the second child and the only daughter in my family. My older brother, who I'll call Omar, is 3 years older than me. Growing up, I was the kid who read everything I could get my hands on. I finished my homework before dinner most nights, not because anyone made me, but because I genuinely loved learning. Teachers used to write things on my report cards like exceptional potential and a joy to teach. I collected those comments the way other kids collected trophies, because in my house, academic praise from a teacher was sometimes the only validation I got that wasn't immediately followed by a comment about how it didn't matter as much for a girl. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further. This isn't a story where I tell you I always knew, with total confidence, that I deserved better than what I was given. There were years where I genuinely believed my father might be right, where I looked at my own ambition and wondered if it was somehow inappropriate, unnatural, something to be ashamed of rather than proud of. Unlearning that belief took years, and honestly, some part of that unlearning is still happening even now, as I sit here telling you this story. But by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a 12-year-old girl who was told she didn't need an education became a 22-year-old woman walking across a graduation stage that her own parents tried, at the very last minute, to take credit for. Let's go back to where it all started. To understand this story, you need to understand the household I grew up in and the beliefs that shaped nearly every decision made inside it. My father, who I'll call Hassan, grew up in a household with very traditional, very rigid ideas about the roles men and women were supposed to play. His own father had raised him to believe that a man's job was to provide and decide, and a woman's job was to support and obey. He carried those beliefs into his own marriage and his own parenting without ever, as far as I know, seriously questioning them. My mother, who I'll call Nadia, largely went along with my father's worldview, at least outwardly. I want to be fair to her here, because her role in this story is more complicated than simple agreement. There were moments, small ones, where I caught glimpses of a woman who might have wanted something different for herself and, by extension, for me. But she rarely voiced disagreement with my father openly, and when she did, it was quiet, private, and almost always overruled. Omar, my older brother, was raised with a completely different set of expectations. From the time he was young, it was simply assumed that he would go to university, build a career, and eventually take over some responsibility for the family's future. Nobody ever sat him down and questioned whether that investment was worth it. It was simply a given, the way gravity is a given. For me, from a very young age, the message was different, even when it wasn't stated outright. Education was something I could pursue casually, as a hobby almost, as long as it didn't interfere with what my parents saw as my real future, marriage, a household of my own, children. Anything beyond a basic education was treated, at best, as unnecessary, and at worst, as something that might make me difficult for a future husband to manage. My grandmother, my mother's mother, who I'll call Amira, was the one significant exception to this entire worldview in our extended family. She had grown up in a different generation, under different pressures, but had somehow arrived at a fiercely different set of beliefs about what women were capable of and entitled to. She would become, later in this story, someone whose role I cannot overstate. I don't use the phrase unwanted daughter lightly, and I want to be careful here, because in a very real sense, I was wanted. My parents loved me. I don't doubt that, even now, even after everything. But there is a difference between being loved and being valued in the way you deserve to be valued, and I lived inside that gap for most of my childhood. I remember being around 8 years old, watching my mother help Omar with a school project, sitting beside him for hours, praising every small contribution he made. When I asked for the same kind of help with my own project a few weeks later, I was told, gently but firmly, that I was old enough to handle it myself. I did handle it myself. I got a better grade than Omar did on his project. Nobody mentioned that. There were small, constant signals throughout my childhood that reinforced this gap. Extra tutoring sessions were budgeted for Omar without a second thought, while requests I made for similar help were met with questions about whether it was really necessary. Family gatherings often revolved around conversations about Omar's future, his potential career, his eventual role in continuing the family name, while conversations about my future revolved almost entirely around eventual marriage prospects. I remember one specific dinner, when I was around 10, where an uncle asked my father, half-jokingly, what he planned to do about my education given how well I was doing in school. My father laughed and said, "She'll do fine. Girls just need enough to get by until they're married." The table laughed along with him. I sat there, 10 years old, quietly absorbing the idea that my own effort, my own achievement, was fundamentally less important than my eventual marital status. I want to pause here and say something important. Kids are remarkably good at reading the room, even when adults think they aren't paying attention. I understood, from a very young age, exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of my own household, long before anyone ever said it to me directly in those exact words. As I got older, the disparities became less subtle and more direct. When Omar turned 16, my parents bought him a used car so he could drive himself to and from his after-school activities, which by then included a debate club, a part-time internship arranged through a family friend, and weekend tutoring for his college entrance exams. When I turned 16 2 years later, I was told that a car was unnecessary for me, since I could simply be driven wherever I needed to go or take the bus. I want to be clear that money wasn't the actual issue here. Our family was solidly middle class, comfortable enough that these were choices, not necessities dictated by financial hardship. The car for Omar, the tutoring for Omar, the internship arranged for Omar, none of it came from a place of, we can only afford to invest in one child. It came from a clear, if unspoken, belief about whose future was worth investing in. I started keeping a private list around this time, in the back of a school notebook, of every instance where I noticed this disparity playing out. It started almost as a coping mechanism, a way of proving to myself that I wasn't imagining things, that this pattern was real and consistent rather than a series of unrelated coincidences. By the time I was 17, that list filled almost 4 pages, front and back. Some entries were small, a new laptop bought for Omar's schoolwork while I used an aging family desktop computer that crashed constantly. Others were larger. Omar's college application fees paid without question, while I was told, when I brought up applying anywhere, that we would talk about it later, a conversation that never actually happened until I forced it. I remember confiding in a close friend at school around this time, showing her a few entries from that list. She was one of the first people outside my own head to confirm that what I was experiencing wasn't normal, wasn't something every family did in some form. That conversation planted a seed of anger in me that would take years to fully grow into something productive. Despite everything, or maybe partly because of everything, I developed an intense, almost defiant determination to go to university. Not just any university, I had a specific one in mind, a well-regarded program in a field I'd become passionate about after a single elective class in 10th grade that completely reshaped how I thought about my own future. I started preparing years in advance in ways nobody in my house ever asked me about or acknowledged. I studied for entrance exams using library books and free online resources, since a tutor was out of the question. I researched scholarship programs late at night after finishing my regular homework, keeping browser tabs open on the shared family computer that I'd quickly close if I heard footsteps approaching. I remember the specific afternoon I received my acceptance letter. I'd applied without telling my parents, using an address I'd arranged with my grandmother Amira so that any correspondence would come to her house instead of mine, just in case. When Amira called to tell me the letter had arrived, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. Amira drove me, since I still didn't have my own car, to her house that same day to open it in person, sitting on her kitchen floor exactly the way I imagine so many of you have opened your own important letters. I got in. Not just accepted, but offered a partial academic scholarship based on my entrance exam scores and my application essay, which I had written and rewritten probably 15 times without a single adult in my own household ever reading a draft. I sat on my grandmother's kitchen floor and cried, and for a moment, in that specific moment, I let myself believe that this achievement alone might be enough to change my father's mind. That seeing black and white proof of what I was capable of might finally shift something in him. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. I waited almost a full week before telling my parents, partly out of fear, partly because I wanted to choose exactly the right moment, as if there was ever going to be a right moment for this particular conversation. I finally told them on a Sunday evening at the dinner table, the same table where I'd absorbed so many small lessons about my place in this family over the years. I remember my voice shaking slightly as I said it. I got in. And I got a partial scholarship, based on my scores. My mother's reaction was complicated, a flicker of something that might have been pride, quickly followed by a glance toward my father, checking his reaction before allowing herself to fully react to mine. My father set down his fork very deliberately, the way he did when he was about to say something he considered final. "That's a nice achievement," he said, in a tone that made it clear he meant the opposite. "But you won't be needing that." I asked him what he meant, even though some part of me already knew exactly what he meant. "Girls don't need degrees," he said, exactly the way he'd said it years earlier at that childhood dinner table. Except this time, there was no room left for interpretation, no plausible deniability about what he actually believed. "You need a husband and a family of your own. A degree won't help you with that. If anything, it'll make you harder to marry off. Men don't want a wife who thinks she's smarter than them." I asked if he would at least help cover what the scholarship didn't, the way he'd covered Omar's tuition without a second thought. "No," he said simply. "I'm not spending money on something you don't need. If you want to waste your time on this, that's your choice. But you'll do it without my help and, honestly, without my blessing either." I remember looking at my mother, silently pleading with her the way I had at so many dinners before this one. She looked down at her plate and said nothing. I left that dinner table in tears, drove again. Amira drove, since this happened often enough that she'd started keeping her car ready on weekends, straight to my grandmother's house, the same kitchen floor where I'd celebrated my acceptance just a week earlier. Amira listened to the entire conversation without interrupting, her expression growing harder and more resolved with every detail I repeated. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "Your father inherited beliefs from his own father that were never actually his to keep, and he chose to keep them anyway. That was his choice. It doesn't have to be yours, and it certainly doesn't have to be your future." She told me, that same evening, that she had a small amount of savings set aside, money she'd been quietly putting away for years, originally intended, she admitted, for exactly this kind of situation. Though she'd hoped she'd never actually need to use it this way. It wasn't enough to cover everything the scholarship didn't, not even close, but it was enough to cover my first year's remaining tuition and a modest amount toward housing. "This isn't charity," she told me firmly when I started to protest, overwhelmed. "This is an investment. I expect you to graduate. I expect you to make something of this. And I expect that one day, you'll do the same for some other girl in this family who needs someone to believe in her the way I believe in you right now." I want to pause here and tell you honestly, I have never in my entire life felt a scene as genuinely believed in as I did sitting on that kitchen floor that night. It didn't erase the pain of what had just happened at my parents' dinner table, but it gave me something to hold on to besides that pain, which, at the time, was exactly what I needed. With Amira's help and the partial scholarship I'd earned entirely on my own, I made the decision to leave home this summer before my first semester began. It wasn't a dramatic, door-slamming departure. My father simply told me, with the same flatness he'd used at dinner, that if I insisted on going, I shouldn't expect financial support from him going forward, in any form, for any reason. I packed what I could fit into 2 suitcases and the trunk of Amira's car. My mother hugged me goodbye at the door, quietly, quickly, glancing back toward the house, as if checking whether my father was watching. She slipped a small envelope of cash into my hand at the last second, whispering that it was just a little something, and asked me not to mention it to my father. It wasn't much, but it was the first time in years I'd felt something from her that resembled active support rather than passive compliance with my father's decisions. I arrived at university housing with almost no experience managing money, cooking for myself, or navigating adult responsibilities that Omar had been gradually prepared for over years. Through the internships and independence my parents had encouraged in him, but never in me. I remember standing in my small dorm room that first night, genuinely terrified, wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. But underneath that fear was something else, something I hadn't felt in years sitting at that dinner table back home, a kind of quiet, cautious hope. For the first time in my life, my future belonged entirely to me. Nobody was going to tell me what I did or didn't need. I was going to find out for myself. The first semester was, without exaggeration, one of the hardest periods of my entire life, and that's including everything that came before it. The scholarship and Amira's contribution covered tuition and a modest housing arrangement, but it left almost nothing for food, books, or the countless smaller expenses that come with living independently for the first time. I picked up a part-time job at a campus coffee shop within the first 2 weeks, working early morning shifts before my classes started, something Omar had never once had to consider during his own college years, since our parents had covered every expense for him without question. I remember one specific week during that first semester where I had exactly $11 to last me until my next paycheck, and I made the decision to skip dinner 3 nights in a row rather than touch the small emergency amount I'd set aside for textbooks. I told no one back home about this. I was too proud and, honestly, too afraid that if my father found out how hard things actually were, he'd take it as vindication of everything he'd already said, rather than motivation to help. Academically, the adjustment was its own kind of obstacle. I had gotten into this program on genuine merit, but I quickly realized that many of my classmates had benefited from years of tutoring, test prep, and academic mentorship that I'd never had access to. I found myself more than once sitting in the campus library until it closed, working twice as hard as classmates around me just to keep pace, let alone stand out. There were nights, I'll admit honestly, where I questioned whether my father had somehow been right, not about the reason behind his belief, which I never once accepted, but about whether I could actually survive this, entirely on my own, without any of the support systems Omar had taken for granted his whole life. Slowly, over the course of that first year, I built something I had never had before, a support system of my own choosing, rather than one dictated by family obligation. I met a small group of friends in my program, several of whom, I learned over shared late-night study sessions, were navigating their own versions of financial hardship or complicated family dynamics. We formed an informal support network, sharing textbooks, splitting grocery costs, trading shifts when one of us needed extra hours for an exam week. I learned, for the first time in my life, what it felt like to be surrounded by people who supported my ambition rather than questioning whether it was appropriate for someone like me to have it. I called Amira every single week without fail, a habit I maintained for the entirety of my time in school. She became, in many ways, my actual emotional home base during those years, far more than the house I'd technically grown up in. She never once let me feel guilty about accepting her help, and she never once let me forget that she expected me to finish what I'd started. My relationship with my mother during this period existed in a strange, quiet middle ground. She would call occasionally, always somewhat furtively, asking careful questions about how I was doing without ever directly acknowledging the situation with my father. I understood, even then, that she was caught between two loyalties she felt unable to fully reconcile, and while it frustrated me deeply at times, I also recognized the limitations of her own position within that household. Contact with my father during this entire period was essentially non-existent. No calls. No messages. It was as if, in his mind, my decision to pursue this degree had already written the ending to my story, and he saw no reason to stay engaged with a narrative he'd already decided would end in failure or regret. By my second year, the financial pressure had eased slightly, thanks to an additional smaller scholarship I qualified for based on my improving grades, along with a second part-time job I picked up doing administrative work for a professor in my department, which paid better than the coffee shop and gave me valuable experience in my actual field of study. Academically, though, this period brought its own distinct challenges. I hit a genuinely difficult stretch during my second year where a required course in an unfamiliar subject area nearly derailed my entire scholarship eligibility. I remember sitting in my advisor's office after a disappointing midterm grade, genuinely afraid that everything I had sacrificed to get here was about to collapse over a single difficult class. My advisor, a woman who had built her own career in a field that, decades earlier, had been almost entirely closed off to women like her, told me something during that meeting that I still carry with me. She said, "The people who told you that you didn't need this were wrong about what you need. But don't let them make you believe that struggling with something means you don't belong here. Everyone in this building has hit a class that humbled them. The only real failure is letting that moment convince you to leave." I worked with a tutor, arranged through a free program the university offered for students on financial aid, twice a week for the rest of that semester. I brought that grade up enough to keep my scholarship intact, though it required more hours of focused effort than almost anything else I'd done up to that point in my life. This period taught me something important that I don't think I could have learned any other way. Resilience isn't the absence of struggle. It's what happens in the specific moments where you have every reasonable justification to quit, and you choose, deliberately, not to. Despite the silence from my father, word of my progress inevitably reached my extended family through my mother and occasionally through Amira, who never missed an opportunity to mention my achievements at family gatherings, sometimes, I suspect, specifically to needle my father. At a cousin's engagement party during my third year, an aunt asked my father, in front of a group of relatives, how the university thing was going for me. My father's response, which was relayed to me later by Amira with visible anger of her own, was, "She's still playing at it. We'll see if it amounts to anything, or if she ends up needing us to bail her out eventually, like these things usually go." Another relative, at a different gathering I wasn't present for, apparently asked whether my focus on school was making it harder to find a suitable match for marriage, given how much time had passed. My father reportedly agreed, adding that he'd warned me this would happen, that no man wants a wife who's spent her 20s thinking she's too good for a normal life. These comments reached me secondhand, filtered through Amira's frustrated retellings or my mother's careful, half-apologetic phone calls, but they stung just as deeply as if I'd heard them directly. There is a particular kind of pain in knowing that the people who are supposed to be your biggest advocates are, instead, actively hoping, or at minimum expecting, that you fail, not out of malice exactly, but because your success would mean they were wrong about something they'd built years of their own identity around believing. I channeled a lot of that pain directly into my work during this period. Every difficult exam, every late night at the library, every ramen dinner eaten alone in my dorm room became something I did partly for myself and partly, I'll admit honestly, out of a growing determination to prove every single one of those comments wrong. During my 4th year, I was selected for a competitive research position within my department, one of only a handful of undergraduate students chosen out of a large applicant pool that included students from much more privileged academic backgrounds than my own. The position came with a modest stipend, which felt, at the time, like an almost unimaginable amount of financial relief compared to the years of careful budgeting that had come before it. But more than the money, it came with something I had been quietly starving for since that dinner table conversation years earlier: genuine, institutional recognition that my work, my thinking, my potential mattered on their own merits, independent of my gender, my marital status, or anyone else's expectations for my future. I called Amira the moment I found out. She cried on the phone, something I had genuinely never heard her do before, in all the years I'd known her. I always knew, she kept saying over and over. I always knew, Layla. I told my mother as well, during one of our careful phone calls. There was a long pause after I told her, and then she said, quietly, I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago, about a lot of things. It wasn't a full reckoning with everything that had happened. But it was the first time she had said those specific words to me directly, without immediately checking to see how my father might feel about them. I did not tell my father directly, but I knew, given the small, tight-knit nature of our extended family, that word would eventually reach him, the same way every other piece of news about me always had. Word did reach him, faster than I expected, through a family group chat where an aunt had shared the news enthusiastically after hearing about it from Amira. What happened next was something I genuinely did not see coming, even after everything. My father, in that same group chat, responded with a message congratulating me, followed by a comment that read something like, "We always knew she had it in her. Proud of the values we raised her with." I remember staring at that message on my phone for a long moment, feeling something between disbelief and a very specific kind of anger I hadn't fully experienced before. The man who had refused to pay a single dollar toward my education, who had told me directly that I didn't need a degree, who had reportedly told relatives he expected me to fail, was now, in a public family chat, quietly repositioning himself as someone who had supported this all along. A few days later, at a family gathering I did attend, specifically for Amira's sake, my father approached me directly for what felt like the first genuine conversation we'd had in years. He mentioned my research position to a family friend standing nearby, saying, "We always pushed her to reach her potential. Her mother and I are very proud." I said nothing in the moment, partly out of shock, partly because I genuinely didn't trust myself to respond calmly in front of extended family. But something in me hardened permanently in that exact moment. I understood, with total clarity, that my father wasn't interested in actually repairing what had happened between us. He was interested in claiming the outcome, now that the outcome looked good, while conveniently forgetting every single choice he'd made that could have gone the other way. A few weeks after that gathering, Amira called me with something she said she could no longer keep to herself, now that things had reached this point. She told me that, years earlier, around the time I was first applying to university, my father had actually been offered a modest inheritance from a distant relative's estate enough, according to Amira's own knowledge of the family finances at the time, to have comfortably covered whatever the scholarship didn't for my entire 4 years, without any real strain on the household budget. He had used that inheritance instead, almost in its entirety, to fund an expansion of Omar's small side business, an investment that, as it turned out, had failed within about 18 months, with most of the money never recovered. I sat with this information for a long time after that call ended. It reframed something fundamental about the story I had believed about my own family for years. I had always assumed, on some level, that my father's refusal to help me was rooted purely in his stated belief that girls didn't need degrees, a belief that was painful, but at least, in his mind, consistent and principled. What Amira's revelation showed me instead was that the same year he told me a degree wasn't worth the investment, he had the actual means to invest in exactly that, and chose, deliberately, to put that money somewhere else entirely, based on the same underlying belief about whose future was worth backing. It wasn't really that he couldn't help me. It was that, given a real choice between his son's speculative business venture and his daughter's already proven academic potential, he chose his son without a second thought, and then built a public justification around gender to make that choice feel principled rather than what it actually was. I decided, after several days of sitting with this new information, that I needed to confront my father directly, in person, rather than let this sit unspoken the way so much else in our family history had. I arranged to meet him alone, without Omar or my mother present, at a small cafe near his office, a neutral setting I chose deliberately, wanting this conversation to happen away from the dinner table where so much of this story had originally unfolded. I laid out what Amira had told me, calmly, without raising my voice, though my hands were shaking slightly under the table the entire time. I asked him directly, "Is it true? Did you have the money to help me, the same year you told me girls don't need degrees, and you chose to invest it in Omar's business instead?" He was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time in this entire story, I watched my father struggle to find words, rather than delivering them with his usual flat certainty. "It wasn't about the money," he finally said, though his tone had lost the conviction it once carried. I believed what I said. I still partly believe some of it. "But you had the money," I pressed. "You had the exact amount that would have made those 4 years so much easier for me. And you chose Omar." He didn't deny it. He said, quietly, almost more to himself than to me, Omar was my son. His future felt like my responsibility in a different way. I know how that sounds now. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that it didn't just sound a certain way, it was exactly what it sounded like. That his belief about girls not needing degrees hadn't actually been the full explanation for years of unequal treatment. It had been a convenient story, one that let him make a choice based on old, inherited beliefs about whose future mattered more, while still feeling, in his own mind, like a principled and consistent man. I want to take you to graduation day now, because I think, after everything you've just heard, you deserve to actually see the moment all of this led to. I graduated with honors, near the top of my program, for years after a dinner table conversation where I was told I didn't need any of this. Amira sat in the front row of that ceremony, wearing a dress she told me she'd bought specifically for the occasion months in advance, certain, she said, that this day was always going to happen. My mother came as well, sitting beside Amira, and for the first time in years, I saw her clap for me without glancing sideways first to check anyone else's reaction. Omar came too, and to his credit, he approached me after the ceremony with what seemed like genuine, uncomplicated pride, telling me he was sorry he hadn't said more, over the years, about how unfairly things had been distributed between us. My father came as well, standing slightly apart from the rest of the group during photos, and I'll admit, even after everything, there was some small part of me that hoped this moment might finally produce something honest from him, a real acknowledgement, rather than another quiet repositioning. What he actually said, when he finally approached me after the ceremony, was simply, "You did well." For words, delivered without the flat certainty of years past, but also without the fuller apology I think some part of me had still been hoping for. I hugged Amira first, longer than I hugged anyone else that day. She had earned that more than anyone in my life, and we both knew it. In the years following my graduation, a few things happened that I want to share, not out of a desire for revenge, but because they're simply part of how this story continued to unfold. Omar's business, the one that had received the inheritance money originally meant to help fund my education, never fully recovered. He eventually closed it and, somewhat quietly, took a position at a company owned by a friend of the family, a stable job, but a significant step down from the ambitious independent future my parents had once envisioned for him, and invested so heavily in. My father's standing within our extended family shifted subtly but noticeably after word spread, through the same family channels that had once relayed his dismissive comments about my education, about what Amira had eventually revealed regarding the inheritance and how it had actually been used. Several relatives who had once nodded along with his comments about girls not needing degrees grew visibly more distant with him, and a few, including the same aunt who had once relayed his comment about me still playing at it, began quietly praising my achievements in the same group chats where he had once tried to claim credit for them. I want to be clear that I take no real satisfaction in Omar's business struggles specifically, since he was, in many ways, also shaped by the same family system that harmed me, just in a different direction. But there is something undeniably poetic in the fact that the exact choice my father made, prioritizing his son's speculative venture over his daughter's proven potential, ended up costing the family far more, in the long run, than simply funding my education ever would have. Today, a few years removed from that graduation stage, I work in a field I genuinely love, in a position I earned through years of exactly the kind of effort my father once told me wasn't worth investing in. I've stayed close with Amira, who I now consider, without exaggeration, the most important influence in my entire life. I've helped in small ways, with the education of 2 younger cousins, girls in our extended family who were beginning to hear some of the same messages I once heard at that same dinner table, years ago. I think of that as fulfilling the promise I made to Amira on her kitchen floor all those years back, that I would one day do for someone else what she did for me. My relationship with my mother has grown, slowly, into something more honest than it once was, though we still don't discuss those years directly very often. My relationship with Omar is warmer now than it's been in years, built on a shared understanding of how the same household shaped both of us, just in very different directions. My relationship with my father remains, to this day, careful, polite mostly, occasionally warm, in brief moments, but fundamentally changed by everything that happened, in a way I don't think either of us expects to ever fully repair, and, honestly, in a way I've made peace with not needing to fully repair in order to move forward with my own life. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: the people who tell you that you don't need something you clearly want, clearly work for, and clearly deserve, are very rarely telling you an objective truth about your own potential. Far more often, they're telling you something about their own beliefs, their own fears, or their own inherited ideas about who gets to want things and who doesn't. I don't regret a single hard night in that dorm room, a single ramen dinner eaten alone, a single moment of doubt I pushed through anyway. Because every one of those moments belonged entirely to me, built by me, in a way that nothing handed to me easily ever could have been. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own family, your own fight, your own version of a dinner table where someone told you what you did or didn't deserve, I want to hear about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, you are not alone in this. And if you want to hear more about what happened with my cousins, with Amira, and with the rest of this family in the years since, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because this story isn't quite finished yet. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.